I'm working on a set of 20 jewelry boxes. Now, I knew I wanted to use a bent lamination for the outside of the box. I started out with a rounded rectangle shape, and then for a while I played around with splitting that into two halves. But I wanted to do something a little bit more different than that. So I started playing around with a rounded triangle. I really liked how that was looking, so from there I made a full-size mock-up from scraps of plywood and paper. I was happy with the shape, but the outside perimeter was a little too long for a single sheet of plywood, so I had to make some slight changes. The next step was to make the bending form out of MDF on the CNC. My original plan was to get the plywood bent around the form with a minimum amount of clamps and a strap, and then attach one end with screws and then pull the other end by tightening bolts through a cleat on the end. Now, I tried this approach before using tension on a bent lamination to pull it tight, and it never works. I keep trying it again anyway. It's such an elegant solution in theory, but it just doesn't work in practice. There's just too much friction. So you're watching my first attempt at trying to do it the normal way with just lots of clamps around the form. I did it on my assembly table and put all the clamps on one side and then had to flip it over without knocking off all the clamps. After trying it that way a few times, I realized that if I could support the form from the center on a post, then I could get the clamps on both sides at the same time without having to flip it. That would both be a lot easier and should produce a better result. The way I was doing it before, I was getting gaps on the second side. So this was my first attempt at doing that, which did not go entirely smoothly, but it showed that it could work at least. Note that I'm using more clamps now. Also note that I'm still starting at one end and then working my way all the way around to the other end. The reason for this was that as you go from the outermost layer to the inside layer, each layer gets shorter. And I hadn't worked out all the lengths for those different layers. So I was just letting that run wild at the end, and where the two ends overlap, one is inside the other, and so I had to start at that inner end and work around to the outer end. So this time it took 31 minutes from when I started clamping it. So now you're watching a much later attempt. I've gone through this process at least 40 times at this point. So now I start near the middle. I start on the table and I get 4 clamps on there, and then I transfer it over to the post. I can start at the middle because I've worked out the length from a mark on the form to that inner end. There's also now a ridiculous number of clamps. I kept using more and more clamps and having to work out ways of fitting them on there, because there would be places in the final lamination that weren't quite a fair curve. There would be high spots and low spots where the clamp was. It still doesn't always come out totally perfect, but I think it's about as good as I can get it. So this time it took 16 minutes, so half the time as before. Having done it so many times now, I know where each clamp goes, I know how to stage everything, and it's all a pretty stress-free experience, whereas before it was like 30 minutes of terror. Coming up with a name for the design with just the right amount of pretentiousness is always the hardest part. But for the time being, it just has a silly code name, Project Wavy Bent. I think now you understand that the bent part of the name is the bent lamination, and we will get to the wavy part in part 2.